So again, welcome everybody. You have joined the anti-displacement strategies, environmental restoration, meet affordable housing. So that is today's session, which is the third webinar on this series of anti-displacement, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So today's session is hosted by the Urban Waters Learning Network. And if you're not familiar with the Learning Network, we are a peer-to-peer network of people and organizations that are working both to restore urban waterways and to revitalize the communities around them. The Urban Waters Learning Network is coordinated by River Network and Groundwork USA, two national organizations. My name is Deanna Toledo. I am one of the coordinators of the Learning Network with River Network. So this year, the Urban Waters Learning Network, we've started to dig more deeply into this topic of gentrification and displacement. This has been, so this webinar series is part of that effort. The issue of displacement has been an issue of concern to members of our learning network for many years. We see, and many of our organizations see, that as we're putting projects into place to restore urban waterways, to build amenities around those waterways, oftentimes those investments are followed or contributing to some of the pressures that lead to gentrification and displacement. And so today's session builds on two other webinars that we have covered on this topic. And so if it seems a little incongruous or beyond mission for urban waters groups, the conversation that has been taking place across our network for a number of years really has focused on how do we make sure that our efforts to either clean up a waterway or to revitalize and provide access to that waterway, how do we make sure that it's contributing really only in positive ways to those neighborhood changes? How do we make sure that as we're advocating for investments for infrastructure, whether it's a greenway, green infrastructure, a park amenity, what can we be doing to help ensure that the very community members we're working to support are able to stay in place in those same neighborhoods? And so that has moved us into a whole lot of other realms that typical conservation or water-focused organizations are not necessarily always keeping an eye on. And so that brings us to today's session. So today we have a couple of recorded webinars. I just want to take a minute to introduce really briefly. The first webinar on our session, in this session, really focused on understanding gentrification and displacement. And so we heard from Tony DeFalco, a leader with Living Cully, a very interesting coalition out of Portland, Oregon, that is working to both support infrastructure investments while at the same time implementing anti-displacement strategies. We offered a second webinar that looked at monitoring neighborhood change using data and looked at two examples, the 606 Greenway project in Chicago and the 11th Street Bridge project over the Anacostia River in DC, and how those projects are incorporated data collection and analysis to either track how the neighborhood is changing or to track the effectiveness of some of the anti-displacement measures they're putting into place. But today we're going to turn our attention to affordable housing, which is arguably one of the most important elements that really help prevent displacement. And so we're super excited to be hearing from two organizations that are national leaders on this front. Our first speaker, and we'll introduce our speakers here in a second, Grounded Solutions Network, which is a new organization for the Urban Waters Learning Network to be introduced to. It's a national organization that supports building communities that are equitable and inclusive, focusing on affordable housing solutions. They put a whole lot of fantastic resources out that I hope you'll explore on their website after today's session. And then we went looking for an example of an entity that's keeping their eyes on both integrating equitable community development and conservation. And it turns out there's not that many of them, but we're lucky to have the Athens Land Trust sharing their story today, which we hope will inspire other entities out there to really work not only toward conservation, but to integrated solutions that really focus on communities as well. So super excited to have them here. Welcome to all of you. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Renee Mazurik, who is going to introduce today's speakers. Renee?
Hi, thanks, Deanna. I'm happy to introduce both of our panelists today. Matt Weber is a municipal lawyer, urban planner, and policy analyst with over 15 years of experience helping communities craft practical solutions to their housing and community development challenges. Prior to joining Grounded Solutions, Matt counseled municipalities in Wisconsin on land use, brownfields, and redevelopment issues, helped community development corporations in Detroit build affordable housing, and researched land tenure and title security issues in legacy cities. Matt earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan and his Juris Doctorate and Master's of Public Policy from the University of Wisconsin. Heather Benham joined Athens Land Trust in 2002 as a summer intern, and after graduating from UGA in 2003 with her joint Masters of Historic Preservation and Juris Doctorate, she was hired on as Athens Land Trust's first full-time employee. Since that time, she has filled many roles: project coordinator, housing director, and director of operations. Now she serves as executive director, working closely with members of the community, other organizations, and local officials to further Athens Land Trust mission. Thanks so much for presenting today, and I look forward to what you have to say.
All right, so with that, Matt, we're going to turn it over to you.
Great, that means I need to unmute, which I have done.
Yeah.
And slideshow from the beginning.
There you go.
Awesome. So welcome all. I am very excited to be talking with you all about anti-displacement tools and strategies.
I might jump in. We're not seeing, you might need to change your display settings.
Oh, it's got to switch it around?
Yep. There you go. That works.
Perfect. So I want to cover basically 3 topics today. I will do a quick review on gentrification and displacement. There are entire graduate seminars taught on the topic, so we're just going to kind of scratch the surface, but I think it's good to start with a common foundation. And then we will talk about anti-displacement strategies, which I group into 3 areas: strategies to protect the current residents who live in the area, strategies to produce new affordable housing, and strategies to preserve the affordable housing that's already there. And then I'll briefly point you to some resources, since we are kind of scratching the surface, some resources you can use to dive deeper into any of these. Before we do all that, we had a couple of questions we wanted to have you all answer, so we're going to do a poll to give me a better sense of who's on the call and what your interests are. And I'm not exactly sure how we're doing this.
So the poll is already up. I don't know if you may be not able to see it. I'll share it here in a second. And
okay.
Some folks are responding already. Let me go ahead and give it a couple more seconds. Looks like there's a couple more folks yet waiting to respond. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. Let me go ahead and share the results. I don't know if you can see this, Matt.
Let me try here.
It may not. Let me read it out to you.
Yeah.
Everybody else, I think, can see it. So the question is, in the community I'm working in, gentrification and displacement are 57% respondents say clearly underway with more to come. 29% say it's already out of control, and 7% each, it's either distant worries but worries nonetheless, or possibly happening but it's hard to tell.
Great, so you folks are really in the thick of this. So these strategies are really going to be relevant to you, and I hope we cover something of value for you all.
Do you want me to go ahead and launch the second poll?
Sure, that would be great.
All right, so everybody should see this poll now. Question number 2, with regard to gentrification and displacement, my organization, if you could pick one of the 4 options, what are you doing regarding gentrification and displacement, if anything? So I'm going to give it a couple of seconds here, let everybody respond. Okay, there's a few more folks waiting to respond. If you want to click on your response, I'll give it 3 seconds, 2, 1. I'll go ahead and close the poll and share it. So Matt, 60% of organizations are partnering with other organizations that are leading on that work. 32% are just starting to think about this issue. And 4% each are either the community's lead voice or forum on this issue, or they're having a hard time classifying and pinning down their own role within it.
Gotcha.
Great. I'll go ahead and hide it.
So it sounds like quite a few folks are partnering, which makes a lot of sense, because to tackle these issues, you really do need a lot of voices and actors in play. So I think it's great to hear that that's a strategy that a lot of folks are adopting. It also sounds like some of you are just getting into this work and are looking for a foundation. So again, I hope we're meeting some of that need today as well. So let's talk briefly about what gentrification is. And I've learned that there are a lot of folks out there who care deeply about the definition of gentrification, and I'm not actually one of those. I think this definition is ballpark fine. It's one I grabbed off the internet. The arrival of wealthy people to a lower income urban neighborhood and the eventual displacement of the original residents and their culture. One of the things I don't particularly like about the definition, though, is I don't think it does enough to highlight the racial aspects of gentrification, because that really is at the heart of what we're talking about when we're talking about gentrification and displacement. And one of the things that I want you all to leave this webinar with is the idea that gentrification is racialized not only when it happens, but before it even begins. And that's because in order for gentrification to take place, there had to be a process of disinvestment before it. And that disinvestment itself was a racialized process in almost all of our urban areas. And it goes back as far, at least to the 1930s with redlining, which if you're not in the housing world, that might be a new term for you. But redlining was the idea that the federal government would draw red lines around particular neighborhoods in a city. And those were neighborhoods where Black and brown folks lived. And they would say, we're not going to insure bank loans in these areas because we don't think that those are safe loans. And since the federal government wasn't going to insure the loans, banks weren't going to make the loans. And that basically meant it was hard to bring resources and investment into these areas. And so in sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, those areas declined, disinvestment. And that was very much the direct product of a government policy. And studies have shown if you take those old redlining maps from the 1930s and overlay them with the areas of town today that are the most disinvested, where the poorest folks live, it's those same areas. So we've, even though that was a long time ago, the legacy of that carries forward. And then there's other events over time that reinforce that kind of disinvestment. White flight was the movement of white folks from the city to the suburbs, definitely driven by individual bias, but also facilitated by government policy. Whether building the highways or the federal GI Bill that allowed World War II veterans to build new housing, but didn't provide funding for investing in existing housing. So you were incentivized to move out to the suburbs with the GI Bill. And then we had things like racially restrictive covenants that closed those suburbs and other white neighborhoods to people of color from moving in. And the courts enforced those covenants. Those were restrictions on a deed that said this house may only be sold to other people who are white. And the courts enforced those until the Supreme Court eventually decided that doing so was unconstitutional. We had urban renewal, which came through cities and ended up breaking up what were vibrant low-income communities of color and dispersing whatever wealth had already accumulated there. More recently, we had the subprime lending process that disproportionately impacted low-income communities of color and sucked whatever resources were there out of the community. And then the foreclosure crisis, which allowed those who had accumulated wealth to acquire more properties at a very low cost and really teed up a lot of areas for gentrification now, because they established that the low base from which profits could be made by reinvigorating them. So when we talk about gentrification, and a lot of the concerns around gentrification are based around race, we need to understand that there's a lot of history to that, and that's where concern comes from. And when we're talking about anti-displacement, in a lot of ways, we can think of these strategies not just, as protectionism, but as civil rights actions to help those who have been disinvested historically to stay in place and enjoy some of the benefits that are actually coming from a reinvigorated neighborhood. So what causes gentrification? Again, lots of different theories out there. I thought that for this conversation, this particular quote really hit home. It comes from a University of Texas report focusing on gentrification, and they're talking about this movement of wealthier white folks to the inner city, moving low-income poor folks out. And they say, in general, gentrification is more likely to occur in places where the housing stock is much more affordable than other places in the same city, and where something has happened to change the perception of the value of that location. Something has happened to change the perception of the value of that location. And I suspect that a big reason why a lot of you are on this call is you're worried that the work you're doing in these urban waterways is that something that is going to change the perception of the value of neighborhoods, or maybe it already has become that thing. And you want to make sure that now that the neighborhood is being reinvigorated, those who have long lived there can see some of the benefits, can actually have access to this nicer, improved waterways, water projects, greenways that you have helped construct. So let's talk really quickly about ways that displacement happens. We've got kind of three concepts in play here. One is direct displacement, and that's residents being forced out. Maybe the landlord has raised the rent and they can't afford to live there anymore. Maybe they just plain evict folks, particularly month-to-month tenants. Sometimes it happens through eminent domain. The local government, wants to put in a boulevard, so they condemn some houses in order to widen the street. Sometimes landlords just disinvest in property to the point that it becomes uninhabitable. Folks move out, and then they're free to redevelop it. Direct displacement is actually, it gets I think people think about this happening a lot. The research shows it doesn't happen as much as you might think. They've compared the, low-income neighborhoods, there's a lot of churn of people moving in and out. And they've compared the rate of low-income folks moving out of gentrifying neighborhoods with the rate of low-income folks moving out of other low-income neighborhoods. And the rate's about the same. So I'm quite certain some people are forced to move out of these neighborhoods, but it's the degree to which that happens is probably overstated in the public imagination. Indirect displacement is much more common, and this is where so again, there's this churn, and ordinarily when one low-income household moves out, another low-income household moves in. But indirect displacement breaks up that process. So when a low-income household moves out, something happens that makes that unit unavailable or unaffordable to new tenants who would also be low income. That might be the rent going up. Maybe the landlord no longer takes vouchers, or maybe they just, they convert it from a rental to a condominium, or they redevelop it and raise the rent, that kind of thing. And then the third form of displacement is cultural displacement. This is, kind of the social fabric and culture of the neighborhood changing to the point where folks who have been long-term residents no longer feel welcome there. So, maybe a church that was at the heart of the neighborhood no longer has enough congregants to support itself, and it ends up closing. And so folks who had long felt a part of the neighborhood because they were part of that church feel left out. The shops and services that are offered in the neighborhood change to meet the wealthier people who have moved in, and the needs of the low-income folks who have long lived there are no longer being met. Maybe language changes it, and perhaps it had been a Hispanic neighborhood or a Korean neighborhood or a Chinese neighborhood, and now it's mostly English. And policing practices may change. When it was a community of Black and brown folks, maybe the police were less observant of quality of life kinds of offenses, but now that they're wealthier white folks living in the neighborhood, they are more concerned about who's using the park or what they're doing in the park or how loud the music is. And so the message that folks who used to be doing things that seemed acceptable and are now getting policed, the message to those folks is you don't belong here. So I've been talking about gentrification largely as a negative, and I recognize that there's a flaw in that. There are a lot of positives to the revitalization that accompanies gentrification, and we need to acknowledge those. I think the conversations around gentrification, the concerns about displacement are, we want those who have been living in this neighborhood to be able to benefit from these positives that are coming from this reinvestment. So let's talk about how do we keep folks in their homes. Again, we're going to talk about these three strategies of protecting current residents, preserving the affordable housing that already exists, and producing more affordable housing units going forward. I'm going to talk about a handful of strategies. It is definitely not all of the strategies out there. And at the end, I will point you in the direction of more information on the ones I'm talking about and ways to learn about other strategies. I just wanted to highlight a few. One, so protecting residents, the question here is how do we keep existing residents in their homes? And one way to do that is just cause eviction protection. So these are ordinances that prevent owners from evicting tenants for reasons other than what's listed in that ordinance. And the ordinance is going to say, just cause are things like not paying rent or not complying with the terms of the lease. But what you can't do is evict people for arbitrary reasons or because they reported your unit to the health department and now you've got a code enforcement against you. You can't evict folks for exercising their rights as tenants. So that can help keep people in their units when you've got a particularly aggressive landlord looking to get them out. Tenant opportunity to purchase laws. Washington, D.C. probably has the best known example of this, but the idea here, these are laws that give tenants the right to purchase a unit or a building before the owner puts it on the market. And usually the way these work is that the residents will assign their right to purchase to, say, a nonprofit. Then the nonprofit gets the resources, acquires the building from the owner, and agrees to keep it as affordable housing. So folks are able to stay in that building. Or another way this has worked is the tenants themselves organize and buy the property with bank loans and such, but then organize it as a limited equity co-op. And again, as a co-op, they're able to control what the rents are and keep it affordable for the long term. Of course, in order for these to work, the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act needs to provide a lot of lead time so that the tenants can exercise their rights and get organized. Another way of keeping folks in their homes is a property tax freeze. So as neighborhoods revitalize, tax assessments tend to go up. There are communities have adopted laws that will freeze or limit the increase in property tax assessments for long-term residents. Often they're triggered by, if the local government has invested X amount in this neighborhood, then we'll freeze the taxes for folks who have lived there, say for 5 years or 10 years before this investment came in. So preserving affordable housing. Here we're looking at how do we keep the low-cost housing options that are already in our neighborhood from disappearing. And what I want to do is focus folks on at-risk housing. And here we need to think about two different kinds of at-risk housing. One is what people sometimes call NOAH, naturally occurring affordable housing. This is basically privately held housing that isn't subsidized, but nonetheless is offered at an affordable rate. And when this housing is in a neighborhood where rents are going up, it's quite susceptible to having the landlord increase the rent. So you may want to look at your neighborhood and say, what sort of NOAH, naturally occurring affordable housing, do we have? And can we rally some nonprofits to acquire that and keep it affordable? The other kind of at-risk housing you need to pay attention to is subsidized housing that is coming to the end of its affordability term. So ordinarily when the government provides a subsidy to construct affordable housing, they'll say you have to keep this housing affordable for a particular period, 10 years, 15 years, 30 years. When that period comes to an end, particularly in a neighborhood where rents are going up, it is very common for the property to then go market rate. They may need to reinvest, fix up some of the features of the property, but they do that with the expectation that they're going to be able to charge a higher rent. So that again is another kind of property that you'd want to be able to identify in the neighborhood where you're working and see if you can get resources to acquire it and keep it affordable. How do you do that? I very much want to point you in the direction of housing preservation networks. These are coalitions of government folks and nonprofits and other community leaders who meet regularly and identify what are our opportunities for preservation in our neighborhood, what are the resources available, and how are we going to prioritize which of these opportunities we take. So either connect with the existing housing preservation network that's in your area, or if there isn't one, work with other folks to get it started. So now how do we produce affordable units? Lots of different ways of doing this, again, scratching the surface, but I do want to point you toward leveraging public land. If you're doing a project in a particular neighborhood, go out and create a map of all of the publicly owned parcels in that area, and then work with your local government to ensure that whatever ends up getting built on that property, it at least includes a portion of affordable units and perhaps is 100% affordable. But it's a great opportunity, as the market heats up in that area, to say we're going to leverage that interest and the fact that we own public land to generate affordable units. Inclusionary housing policies are somewhat similar. So these are policies that either require or incentivize the creation of affordable housing when new development occurs. And there are a couple different flavors of this. So mandatory inclusionary housing basically says if you're building a project over a certain size, say 5 units or 10 units, then a certain amount of that housing must be affordable to low-income residents. So 10% to 30% is kind of the common range. So if you're building 10 units, you know, 1 to 3 of those units would have to be offered to folks at an affordable price. In some states, you can't require, you can't create mandatory inclusionary housing. So local governments are stuck with voluntary programs. Mandatory programs are way more productive in terms of producing units, but often states have not empowered their local governments to do that. So voluntary programs basically create incentives for developers to add affordable units. They may allow greater density on the site in exchange for more units. They may expedite the permitting process, or they may provide a dollar subsidy in exchange for providing affordable units. The goal of both approaches, of course, is to create mixed income communities, which can be you know, very healthy norm to establish for a neighborhood that is seeing some revitalization. And then I'm just going to mention community land trusts. As an organization, Grounded Solutions Network is effectively sort of the trade association for community land trusts around the country. The network part of our name refers to connecting all these community land trusts. Heather is going to give you a deeper dive into community land trusts, but the whole idea of a community land trust is they hold the land that housing sits on, or any land, and hold it in trust for the community. And when it's housing that's on that land, they're effectively committing to keeping that housing affordable in perpetuity. So anytime that housing gets resold or anytime it's rented out, it's going to go to people at lower income and at a price that they can afford. So I'm just going to talk briefly on resources. One of the handouts is this What About Housing Policy Toolkit. If you don't download it today, it is also available on our website. This is a listing of all of the policies we cover in that toolkit. What I like about the toolkit is it gives you a flavor of what the policies are, and then it's a great, I call it a finding tool, because it'll point you in the direction of case studies on how folks have used this particular policy, sample ordinances. It'll point you toward expert organizations who are authorities on this particular approach, and highlight research around that particular policy. So take a look at that housing policy toolkit. It is available on our website at groundedsolutions.org. You can always email me. I'm happy to point you in that direction. I'm going to skip over Q&A for now because I want to leave time for Heather to do her bit, and then we will have Q&A at the end. So I am going to try to switch this. No, that didn't work.
Heather, you should have the control now. Thank you so much, Matt. Please, everybody, go ahead and type your questions into the question box, and we'll get through them after Heather has done her presentation. So Heather, do you have the control? Oh, there you go.
I think I got it.
You do.
Okay, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So, Athens Land Trust.
Actually,
We're that oddball group that works in the space of affordable housing, and we did in 1994. Sorry, I could kind of hear somebody else something, but I guess I'll keep going until I see a message. I'm what?
You're coming across a little patchy on your sound.
Oh no.
Keep going, but if you changed
Okay, I
anything.
can hear you now.
Okay.
But you can hear me?
Yes.
That's what matters. Okay. So we were founded in 1994 with the dual purpose of protecting land from development and developing affordable housing. And what our founders realized is when they were getting started, they had this vision of this magnificent, wonderful, perfect neighborhood where anyone could live there, and there was open space and access to trails and the river and a community garden. and it was just going to be an amazing place. And they realized the more land they protected, the more expensive the lots were for development. And what happened was they started pricing out some of their friends from the neighborhood. And during the course of this development, one of the founders, her car broke down in Atlanta, and a woman picked her up and gave her a ride to an office so she could use the phone. And she said, "I'll take you to the land trust office." And Nancy said, "Oh, I'm starting a land trust," because they were going to protect this land in their neighborhood. And the woman said, "I bet you're not starting a real land trust." And she said, "What does that mean?" She said, "Well, this is the kind of land trust that makes it possible for me to live in Atlanta." And so that opened their eyes, I think, to other opportunities and options. And so that's where we started. And I have been here a while now. And I will say early on, when you would answer the phone, it was pretty clear who was calling. It was either someone who'd had land in their family for generations, and they were looking to protect that land from development and receive tax benefits in exchange, or it was members of the community who had never had access to property and were looking for their first home. So over the course of the years, it was so stark, and we kept trying to figure out how to make this work more holistic and more meaningful. And that started our community agriculture program, and now there's education programs, and you'll see as I go through, there's a lot going on. If I can make it move forward. Okay, here we go. It says one of the few. I think we're being generous. I suspect we're the only conservation community land trust in the country still to this point. But if anyone knows otherwise, stick it down in the chat box so I won't say unique. But this is that's basically going over kind of the scope of some of our work. And as you'll see, there are all kinds of other things come up. So there's a big focus on affordable housing. We have 60 single family homes that we've developed in Athens. We have 126 units of affordable multifamily housing that we've developed. We have education classes. We've got a network of community gardens, 2 urban farms, economic development opportunities. So I think earlier it was mentioned, the cultural displacement can happen, and that's one thing that we're pretty aware of is there's a lot of coding that happens and signaling that happens of who a neighborhood is meant for. And that's one of the things that we're working to do is build the neighborhood economy so that when other people look at the neighborhood that we mostly target for our work, that they see who lives there and spend dollars with the people who live there so that they can continue to stay. We've got youth development, and then of course we protect land from development, and we've created a land access program. We just placed one of our young urban farmers who went through the program, graduated. He just gained access to land to start his first farm on his own. This is the neighborhood. To give you a little context, this is the neighborhood where we do a lot of work. It's about a mile from the University of Georgia and downtown Athens. Athens, Clark County is the smallest county land-wise in the state of Georgia, and a third of the county is owned by the university, so it's off the tax rolls. So there's a lot of pressure in our in-town neighborhoods for student housing and other housing. And the reason, I think one of the reasons, I guess there's multiple reasons, but one of the reasons this neighborhood is still affordable and is still occupied by African-American residents is because clearly there's the redlining history and all that, but that's been washed away in some other adjacent neighborhoods because of zoning issues and proximity to downtown. The added challenge of this neighborhood is that there's a creek that runs through the neighborhood that floods. And the county over the past 10 years has done a lot of work to mitigate some of that, but there's still some flooding incidents. We were able to work with the neighborhood to secure some funding. So I think it's going to be fixed soon, which also, you know, like many of you probably leads me to worry about what's going to happen when the flooding's gone. The added bonus is the neighborhood was laid out completely untraditionally and substandard. So the streets aren't to code, there aren't many sidewalks, it's hilly, and there's just lots of challenges. But it's still there and it's serving a community. This is the piece that I think it sometimes gets lost from community land trusts as well. It's not just community land trusts that are doing this. I think a lot of groups sometimes miss this point, which is a big piece of the way you try to help people stay in a community is you try to understand what their needs are and what's going to make it possible, and education around what some of the challenges might be. So we spend a lot of time and energy on community charrettes. We have community dinners. We have learning trips. We've taken community residents all over the country. That the picture is from Asheville, North Carolina. We've probably taken 75 or 80 community members to Asheville to look at a similar project to something that a lot of the residents have been asking for to happen in their neighborhood. And so in that picture, I see the mayor and I see housing community development staff and department directors. You know, that's the idea, is to take community members with the decision makers so that people can get on the same page about advancing residents' vision. Voting priorities, it's another thing that we spend time on, is, you know, prior to getting grants or in the midst of trying to get a grant, it's been important to us to have community meetings where residents get to vote and prioritize what it is they want to accomplish from the grant. So we're fortunate to have I should know the name, SSDN. It's a Southern Sustainability Network Directors Network grant in partnership with our local government sustainability office. And through that grant, you know, we didn't come in with ideas of what community needed. We came in with some kind of bucket areas to consider, and then let the neighborhood residents choose what they thought was most important. And even in the course of the conversation, it was helpful because there was a part of the neighborhood that really still has issues with flooding, while the other part of the neighborhood, it had been addressed and fixed, and they didn't think it was an issue anymore. And so just having everybody on the same page about whether something's been solved or not is important. And then through that process, an advisory board was created, and a big part of the reason for the advisory board is we were able to work with the neighborhood to advocate, and there's $4 million in infrastructure dollars that's going to be targeted to their neighborhood, and they get the decision-making role. It's a pilot program with local government to shift how some of this stuff happens, where it's not staff always determining highest and greatest need, but they're actually receiving input and being held accountable by the community for the projects that are being delivered on the ground. And you see there, I have that, it's kind of most important. I mean, people get tired of meetings and input sessions and being used as guinea pigs if there's nothing tangible coming out of anything. So it's that bringing whatever resource you have to the neighborhood to help build trust, so they see, you know, it's where you put your money. People realize that that's what you value. Neighborhood revitalization. So like I said, there's 40 homeowners in that neighborhood, 16 lease purchasers. That's a big conversation, maybe that's more relevant to a lot of housing providers. One of the reasons we provide that program is, hopefully most of you recognize that the system is still flawed. You know, redlining was maybe a thing of the past, but there's still all sorts of institutional barriers that are stopping people of color from accessing loans and credit. And so that program allows a way for people who maybe aren't starting at the same point to have a chance to purchase these homes that we're developing in their neighborhood. And we also have it's a large word of mouth, so that it's long-term renters in the neighborhood are the ones that are buying the homes. And that just requires a lot of work and relationship building. let's see, the 15 low-income homeowners served through home repairs and rehab services. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute and kind of explain where that came from. This, the other programs, education, job training, commercial infrastructure, all these things are coming out of these charrettes and community meetings and dinners. And we believe, like I was saying, that this economic development is what will help preserve the cultural fabric of the neighborhood. I'm under no illusion that we are the silver bullet and we have solved this issue. I'm constantly at fear that there's going to be another wave of investors coming in. They're coming in now, and you know, it's always a risk. And so we're trying different things. As you read about gentrification, like I spend a lot of time reading about, there's no clear answer of what can stop it from happening. It's just about, I guess, trying to make sure that the people who are there are benefiting if it does happen. The youth programming, so this is the Young Urban Builder program. This came out of one of the learning trips we took of neighborhood residents to Birmingham, Alabama, to look at a major revitalization project for a neighborhood. And one of the residents said to me as we're on this bus tour, you know, this all looks really good, but if they do this in our neighborhood, no one's going to want to live next to my raggedy house. Those are her words. And I could totally understand what she was saying. It's not usually how major revitalization works. They don't leave interesting looking homes next to these large investments that are coming in. And then we went and did surveys at the high school to talk to them about what their needs were and how they saw the neighborhood, because a lot of them live in the high schools in the neighborhood. The feedback was, one, they feel unsafe walking past a lot of vacant and blighted properties on their way to school, because that's where drug dealers hang out and prostitutes, that sort of thing. And so there was some safety issue around that. And then jobs. They wanted access to jobs because a lot of them have a hard time getting their first job if they've never had experience with a job. So we pulled those two things together and created a Young Urban Builders program. And so it's young people. They're not all high school students. Some are in alternative schools, credit recovery programs. We're pretty flexible, and we're fortunate that we've got foundation funding, and local government has put in matching funding for the first time ever to create this, so that we're not having to use some national model that doesn't necessarily work for our neighborhood. A number of the students in the program are from the neighborhood, and the way they've been recruited a lot is they're walking by the houses that we're working on, because all the houses are in that neighborhood. And so they just start coming by and asking questions and then figure out what's going on. And a lot of them have gotten on the list. So when a spot opens up, they get into the program. This right here, to me, I mean, our affordable housing program, like I said, we're going in and building new homes, taking down blighted homes, renovating and rehabbing whatever we can save homes, and selling to low-income first-time home buyers with this target to neighborhood residents. It's good. It's a really good thing. A big plus of our program is these new homes, they don't impact the neighbors' property taxes, because our homes are sold with resale restrictions, and they're not a fair market sale because they're sold at subsidized rates. And so the value of the home isn't used to jack up everybody else's property value, which I think is a big plus when you're looking at gentrification issues. But this other program, I find just as important, if not more, to keep residents who are homeowners already in the neighborhood. One of the struggles that we've had, and probably many of you, if you're doing this kind of work, the homes, a lot of them have title issues. They're heir property, which means they've been left, they've gone without probate or without a will, they've been left to family members. And so if you don't have a clear title, you can't get access to loans to do home repairs. The other reality is because it's a majority African-American neighborhood, over 50% poverty rate, it's hard to get contractors to go in and take on projects in this neighborhood. So creating this program, it's just been amazing what it's done to keep people in their homes and to make it possible for some to move back into their homes. So we had a house through that environmental grant with the sustainability office where she was using 900 gallons of water a day because there was a leak between the street and her house. And to me, I mean, we have a water shortage in Georgia, if you haven't heard, and it's a big issue. It's also a big issue for her because she's got these giant water bills that she can't afford. And so she moved out of her house to just get away from it. And we were able, with their partnership and with the Young Urban Builders, to go in and repair the line, and she can move back into her house now. So I just think, I guess the point I'm trying to make is community land trusts are great. And it's definitely controlling land in a neighborhood so that it's permanently affordable and the neighborhood has a say in what happens on that property. But it's just so much more than that, I think, to try to make this stuff work. Anyway, Young Urban Builders. And let's see here, make sure I'm covering all this stuff.
Heather, you probably want to start wrapping it up here.
Yep, I am almost to the end. I wanted to highlight this for a lot of you all. So like I said, the high school students are asking for jobs. So in each of our program departments, we've created youth opportunities. And so this is some slides, pictures from our Youth Conservation Corps that we created. And so we've got a 6-week program in the summer where kids are working in their community and in their neighborhood, so there's relevance to them, doing air quality testing, water quality testing, and just learning different things. One of my concerns is if we don't help introduce a new generation to why this stuff matters, and for a lot of these kids, they're the ones who are more impacted than a lot of others. And so just, you know, being really thoughtful about creating opportunities that meet their needs and expose them to something that I think will help them throughout their life. And so it's a paid program for the kids. So they get paid for 6 weeks in the summer and they learn job training skills, but they're also learning all sorts of, they do invasive removal, they plant trees, not so much in the summer, but we do other like spring break and things, they do that sort of stuff. Anyway, that's some of what we do. And if you have questions, I look forward to hearing them.
There's a number of questions, so I'll go ahead and start posing them. One, I think, was for Matt. Matt, how do you recommend figuring out if a particular community has any of these policies or programs that you outlined? Is there a database or a report anywhere that rates cities across the country according to their anti-displacement efforts?
So it is not necessarily easy. We do have, so if you're interested in inclusionary housing, we have a separate website called inclusionaryhousing.org that provides a map of the entire country that shows where mandatory inclusionary housing is available and where other places where it's just voluntary. There are so one of the policies I didn't highlight was rent control, because in a lot of states that is just, you know, preempted by state law. So you can search for preemption statutes around the country and you can find maps of those. But more accessible would be someone in your city's community development department. They have to put together a 5-year plan that says how they're going to be spending their community development dollars. So that plan would help at least guide you toward what their priorities are and how they see it fitting in with current city policy. So it may give you a hint of what the policies are. And then accessing whatever housing and community development networks you have in your own community would be another entry point to that information.
Great. Another question, and I know there's been some chat here in the box of examples of neighborhoods prone to flooding where once they put in some stormwater management practices like green infrastructure that led to gentrification. Are there any such examples that either of you can point to? I know our experience has been that it's really hard to say, okay, green infrastructure went in, gentrification resulted from it. Oftentimes there's just so many factors that contribute to it. So I don't know, Matt and Heather, if you have any examples or it's different experience, understanding what the tipping point is.
And they're only concerned about, I guess, the flooding stuff, because I mean, clearly I think trails, I hate saying it even out loud, but you know, the Beltline in Atlanta is quite an example. And I'm trying to think of anything with flooding. I don't see how it couldn't impact if there's places that are in high demand. When you mitigate a problem like that, it wouldn't begin. But I can't think of anything off the top of my head real specific.
Yeah, I don't either, other than, you know, there are a lot of examples where you put in major infrastructure projects like flood control. But yeah, expressly tying that to the gentrification that followed, that is just a little more amorphous than I can really point to.
Also a question about, are there any examples of gentrification that you know of that has happened in the wake of Superfund projects going in? Does that trigger any suggestions or thoughts?
Not for me. We don't have a lot of Superfund projects down here, or right around here.
Yeah, I guess for me, it not necessarily Superfund per se, but brownfields kinds of redevelopment projects are pretty common. And if they are of sufficient scale, you could certainly point to those as triggers, partial triggers for gentrification. But I can't point you to one particular project that I'd say, you know, this happened and then the whole neighborhood gentrified as a result of that.
There's Atlantic Station in Atlanta is one, the old rail yard that was redone that's completely gentrified a neighborhood.
Well, thank you both. There some examples. Matt posted an article referencing the Los Angeles River revitalization, and an RDC article that starts to talk about equitable development planning. And that is another place where we found a coalition, the La Rosa Coalition, that's now emerging to look both at, you know, promoting the revitalization and restoration of the river while at the same time starting to plan ahead to the extent that it's still ahead to put some of these practices into place. So that could be another interesting example to look at. You'll see the link there in the box. All right, well, with that, we are almost at the top of the hour. I want to just thank you both, Matt and Heather. Again, this is a great overview, and Heather, your work straddling both of these worlds is a big inspiration to, I think, a lot of folks on this call and across our networks. I do want to encourage folks to, well, immediately following this session, you'll receive an email in about 2 hours with a link to both the evaluation survey. I ask you, please take a minute to provide us some feedback. It will also have a link to the recording, and I will put links to some of these articles and resources that have been highlighted here in the chat box. We also have another webinar coming up. This is in our theme of climate resilience, but it also is very much looking at equitable recovery. And one of the examples that we'll present here is from New Orleans and what happened post-Katrina recovery. It is not unrelated from the topic that we're addressing today. And finally, recorded webinars, resources, a lot of studies and guides, including the one that Matt referenced. You can find them at urbanwaterslearningnetwork.org. I do want to remind everybody, 57% of you, I think, said you are part of some sort of partnership locally to address issues of gentrification and displacement. We would love to hear more examples about what folks are doing on the ground on this topic. And so let me encourage you to propose a workshop at River Rally, our national conference that's coming up in May of next year in San Antonio. Unfortunately, we are planning way ahead of time, and so Tuesday is the deadline to propose a workshop session, and you can find where to do that at that link. Also, if you know a hero that you want to recognize for their work toward river conservation or water protection, please submit their name there. So with that, again, thank you, Heather, and thank you, Matt. Here is my email address, as is my colleague Maria Brodeen's, who also coordinates Urban Water Learning Network activities on behalf of Groundwork USA. If you want to hear more about this topic or have suggestions for future webinars, or want to know more about the Learning Network itself, please be in touch with us. So with that, any final words as we close it off, Heather and Matt?
Nope, thanks for hosting.
No? Yeah, appreciate it.
Thank you both, and thank you everybody for joining us. Appreciate it. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.